very much, and welcome everyone. We're expecting a few more, so we'll just get started, I think, and let people come in as they arrive.
More like that then, sorry.
It's okay. So this session is about the PBS Academy standards that are being produced at the moment. How many of you have heard about the PBS Academy? Yeah. Okay, fair few, and about the standards or the project? Yes, that. So I'm Louise Den. There's been a bit of false news created in the social media about this event because I've appeared on the
Programme, the Festival Guide,
as Dr. Den. Not there yet, Viva in a few weeks' time. But I wouldn't want anybody to think that I had anticipated the outcome of the Viva. I'm based at Warwick University, where I manage a network of researchers. And basically, we're involved in research projects that sort of focus on trying to get evidence-based practice into day-to-day practice. And one of the projects we've adopted is around PBS and how do we upscale PBS? How do we get more people to have access to PBS? You know, it's really frustrating that we've got something that the evidence suggests is effective, and yet the people who really can benefit from it are not getting that access to it. So that's what sort of my work is all about. Alison, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Allison Brandt. So for those of you who don't know about the PBS Academy, it's just a collective of interested people who are wanting to further PBS. So none of us work for the PBS Academy, we just do work for it. You know, we write things and we produce things, but we all have a job as well. So my job, when I'm not doing stuff with PBS Academy, is I work up in the northeastern Cumbria. So we have no power up there at the moment because we've had these massive storms. So I'm up sort of up near the Scottish border. And at the moment I'm working with Transforming Care as part of that programme, working with family carers and social care providers in thinking about how they can learn some of the skills around positive behaviour support so that they can implement it. And when I'm not doing that, I work in a team in a community setting where I'm supporting family carers and services with people that they support around their behaviour. So that's me.
And as Alison said, the PBS Academy doesn't actually exist. There's no formal entity. We're just a group of people. It started off as we actually have meeting notes that say the group with no name. And the background to it was just our concern that PBS was being bandied about, PBS was appearing in policy documents without there being a common understanding, common shared understanding of what PBS is. So the very first piece of work, some of you may be familiar with, was it started off actually with Nick Gore's paper defining PBS for the UK, and making that very clear, describing all of the components of what good PBS, what PBS practice looks like. And that paper was done in conjunction with some accompanying papers, Richard Hastings describing a model, a sort of forward to a causation model of challenging behaviour and why PBS is an effective way of supporting people with learning disabilities at risk of behaviour that challenges. So the background to the STANDS project with those of us who were involved in what we then called a PBS coalition, we went on to develop a competence framework for PBS, and then the development of a set of resources to help put the competence framework in place. And then what about 18 months ago, mine doesn't that work? The final report of the Winterbourne inquiry, the transforming rural led to the Transforming Care Programme, that there's a Steve Bubb report was produced that amongst its recommendations were the sort of acknowledgement that PBS was the most effective way of supporting people with learning disabilities at risk of behavioural challenges, and they suggested that we consider accreditation of training as part of a sort of workforce development, with also a view to establishing some formal body to be able to manage PBS standards and so on. Now, that's the background to us, the PBS Academy, identifying developing standards as the next piece of work that we could usefully be involved with. The standards that are being developed are not going to necessarily lead to an accreditation system, because to have an accreditation system you need to have an infrastructure, to have an infrastructure you need to exist. So there's parallel discussions going on about whether or not we do set up some sort of a body, and what that body might look like, how it might be, how the governance, all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that we were very keen when we decided we were going to go ahead and develop the standards was that setting up a body involves a lot of detailed processes. It takes time away from doing the stuff that we really want to do, and the stuff that we really want to do, the functional stuff we want to do, is help upscale delivery of PBS and also help develop best practice.
And that point, I think, about, PBS is not, it's not new. It's been in policy guidance now for a number of years. It's become really sexy, isn't it? Everybody's doing PBS. And we were very fearful, I think, that unless we acted quite swift, we just waited around waiting for a body to be formed to do some of that work, that we will have missed the boat. And that people are all doing PBS, but are they really doing PBS? And actually, PBS is a really good evidence-based approach. It's effective, it works, if it's PBS. But if it's not PBS, it's just somebody calling something PBS, but they're not doing anything different, actually, then you get commissioners saying, well, we tried that and it didn't work, so actually we'll move on to the next thing. So there was some urgency about it, wasn't there?
And actually, it's a good point you raised, because it came up this morning in our discussions, the RCT, the research that was done by Angela Hastings, suggesting that PBS may not be effective. We would argue that the PBS, that what was delivered in that study was not PBS as defined in the Gore et al. Paper and as described in some of the resources that we've developed in terms of what does good look like, and certainly would not meet the standards that we're going to give you a taster of this today. Now, I apologise, because when Lindsay set this up, she said, would you like to come and talk about PBS standards in September? And this was back in May, June, and I said, yes, of course, because they'll be out there, you'll all be looking at them, you'll all be puzzling over them, thinking, oh my God, what do we do next? How do we put these into place? They're not published, you haven't got them. And I can't actually, we're able to share the approach and some of the sections of the standards, but they're not actually going to be fully available until October the 11th. But they will be published on October the 11th. So, what we've got, what you will be able to see on October the 11th, and they will be available on the PBS Academy website, but also if you want to leave me email addresses and so on, I'm happy to send you copies of them. What we will be launching that day are two sets of standards. One is standards for service providers and teams, and the second is standards for training. We have been working on a draft set of standards for individual practitioners, but that's got a whole host of complications, and some we feel that for the time being we're going to get started with these and then see where we go with those others. So improving the quality of positive behaviour support, the standards for service providers and teams. The basic structure of the standards is they're divided into 5 domains. So the background to this structure is that we've looked at standards that have been set by other fields, other disciplines within health and social care provision, and we have followed the same sort of structure as others. So the first domain being all around, we've called it the experience of the person. In most other disciplines it would be patient experience. And then sort of clinical stuff around assessment, functional contextual skills-based assessments, and developing a functional-based behaviour support plan. And then sets of standards around facilities, resources and workforce. And the 5th domain, keeping all people safe, least restrictive practice and maximising quality of life. Each of those 5 domains appears as you have a domain heading, a short description of each domain, and then under that the standards associated with each and the criteria for each standard. So, as an example, domain 5, keeping all people safe, least restrictive practice and minimising quality of life. We start with every single domain starts off with the same thing. The purpose of the domain is, and in this case, to ensure that there are systems and processes that create and maintain safe, predictable and stable environments that maximise quality of life. Services commit to least restrictive practice and support is delivered within the relevant legal and ethical framework. Most people, with and without learning disabilities, want to live and work in safe, attractive environments where they have a sense of purpose and feel at home. So that is followed. You have the domain, then the standards. So each has got a number of standards, and that's not all 5, some of them 7, some of them 9, depending on the domain. And each standard starts off with the service evidences, that da-di-da-di-da. And as I say, those are then underpinned with criteria. So taking for domain 5, standard 5, the service evidence is a commitment to using least restrictive practices and monitoring and reducing the use of restrictive supports. So that then broken down, the criteria that back that. So the statement of values includes a commitment to using least restrictive practices. The service has a clearly outlined process around the use of restrictive practices. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, is everybody clear about that? You are going to get examples to look at in detail, as we want to work through some questions with you, because it's all very well. Before I say that, I'll go on to just show you the structure of the standards for training. Similar, there are 7 domains: training, course and development of content, personnel delivering training, resources and facilities delivering training, assessment, evaluation and records. And then each of those domains has a list of standards. So it's slightly different. It doesn't have sort of the standard and the criteria. It has standards, and for the most part, those are pretty self-explanatory for the training ones. Okay. I hope that will all become clearer as you start to work through some examples. Now, when we were developing these standards, we were locked in rooms poring over the words of these things, and the great difficulty we had was that when you're setting a set of standards, we want to say that what's happening at the moment isn't. That we have many examples of wonderful practice, but across the board, we're not there yet. The level of service delivery is not meeting the needs of the population that we are trying whose quality of life we are trying to improve. Not improve, maximise. We're probably still in the improvement state, but where we would like to get to the point where we can say that because we're delivering, that everybody who um, who wants access to PBS is able to get the support that they need and that their quality of life is maximised. So we've set the bar pretty high, as you're about to find out. But we are very conscious that we don't want to make it so difficult that it's absolutely unattainable. When you see them, you might think, actually, some of these are really, really difficult. We are aware of that. But the thing is that if we didn't set the bar high, then we would be saying that not having a high standard was acceptable for
It's like current state, isn't there, and future state. So we're talking about a future state, and so we will be the first to say that we personally don't need some of the criteria for some of these. We've got to aim high, otherwise we're not actually going to raise the quality.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. But that thing that you've got there about what comes easy won't always last. So we could just write a standard of what's happening now, but actually we know that's not good enough. But what will last won't always come easy, and I think that's our question.
That's our question, our dilemma, and what we're going to do now is we want to divide you up into groups, give you examples from the standards, and we'd like you to consider in your groups, how do you decide where you are in relation to the standard? Now, I don't know, you're not all service providers, you're not all training providers, but perhaps think about within your role, or if you're a recipient of services, if you're a parent carer, think about the relative that is receiving support. What resources do you need? You know, it sort of start to think about how can you get there, because we recognise that not everybody will be there. My hand up, I don't meet the standards for PBS training, although I have got a qualification that meets it. I don't actually have a training qualification. I need to, if I'm going to meet these standards and decide that I'm going to go out and start delivering training to organisations, I'm going to have to go and get a training qualification. And it's incumbent upon me to do that. And that's the thing. I think what we're trying to do is to say, here are the standards, and then for all of you as stakeholders, because it's stakeholders who are going to be putting this in place, gives you the opportunity to demand these things of training providers, of service providers, to say to commissioners, these are the standards that you need to be setting, to be commissioning against, and so on. Okay, so these are the questions we'd like you to think about. How do you decide where you are in relation to them, or how do you assess where you are and identify what needs to happen? What resources you need to meet the standard, and you can share that with us, because as part of the work that we're doing, we want to be able to do that enabling piece and to develop additional resources. Where will these resources come from? What are the kind of barriers, facilitators to make it happen, and how do you know when you will have achieved it? So shall we work in groups of, say, 4? Before we go through some of these things, I had a question from this group, and I asked them to save it to then share with everybody.
Who is going to check these standards?
Very, very good question. And something that...
Very, very easy answer, no one.
There's the first stumbling block there.
Yes, so, absolutely, first stumbling block. So when we had that recommendation, and that was clearly about accreditation, and accreditation implies that somebody's going to come along and give you some sort of kite mark or standard, a check or whatever, sign you off. There has been debate after debate after debate about this. Some service providers want it, some service providers are not so sure that that's the right way forward. Apart from developing the standards, we've also been looking at avenues for accreditation. And one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that most accreditation programs add an extra layer of costing for service providers. And at the moment, service providers do not have that margin. So I am not entirely convinced. I do believe that you need to have some sort of lever mechanism, something, to be able to, because if you just do you can do a self-assessment, and it's quite easy to go and say, oh yeah, well, we know we don't do it exactly like that, but what we do is fine, and we can justify that, and we can tick this box and tick this box. The other thing is that tick box attitude is not something we want. We want these to be sort of setting a real goal, and it's an ongoing.
I've done that now.
It's an evolving process, because actually, yes, you may be able to meet the standards to this level, but could we actually do it in a slightly? And it's to help. We want it to help people just reflect on practice and so on. So how you go about doing that, I'm not sure. The one thing for me that is clear from all of the discussions I've had with stakeholders is that the thing that drives service providers is CQC. Meeting the hoops that they have to go through to be able to pass a CQC inspection. And we have been engaged in discussions with CQC, because actually if CQC were to say PBS is the framework for working with people for supporting people with learning disabilities at risk of behaviour changes, then they'd just be looking at this and saying, okay, that's going to be, maybe I'm being naive, I don't know, but that's my hope, is that that would be the way of actually helping, because it's, for me, it's not, as I said earlier, this is not just about meeting a set of hoops, this is also about identifying ways to help as a community, as stakeholders, because this is not just, I mean, we've got a set of standards here for service providers and for training providers. This is about the whole community, and because PBS as a framework involves all stakeholders, and everybody has a part to play in this. And it's also about identifying the key agents for change and enabling key agents for change to be empowered to demand, to ask questions, to insist upon, because it's as an individual, it's your right to have access to a service that meets these standards.
I think in Wales they couldn't just do that. SIW wouldn't do that because other products exist. So if you said PBS, you have to do PBS. Because other different similar products exist, you couldn't do it because it would discriminate against all those other products.
And that's that has been to date CQC's argument to us, is they don't favour one approach over another. Now, my comeback on that is that I think that's still viewing PBS as an intervention as opposed to a framework. And if we can get across that idea of it being a framework, then because within that framework all these other packages and so on, that there's room for them. The competence framework says we embrace evidence-based practice that is appropriate to the individual's needs, recognizing that the PBS umbrella is not going to solve a person's every need. What it's going to do, it's going to provide that framework for maximising their quality of life, but then also highlighting the areas where you need additional support. And for some,
to get an excellent, which is, they are rare to get an excellent, but something like this, if that's it, you should be sort of marketing this, that if you say to CQC, well look, we're meeting your standards, but also we're doing this because actually it's over and above, it's well over. No, nobody's checking it, but we're passionate about raising the standards.
Yes.
My God, you've got a tick in the box anyway.
Yes.
As far as CQC is. So they may not take that on now or ever, but still, they are still looking for companies, providers that are going way over and above what the base standards are. And that's important.
And that may well be a solution, that if provider organisations get together and do some sort of peer review or something like that, and have your own standard setting, not standard setting, because these are the, we hopefully have identified the standards, but standard maintaining, standard, you can work together. Perhaps we can,
we found that was one of our bits of feedback actually, was about external validation.
Yep.
How do you do that? And maybe that's a good solution, that like peer support. The trouble is, there's this model, isn't there, that carers are in competition with each other. It's like a market, and it's a real shame. I think it's done a lot of damage actually, because we're all really working towards the same goals.
Yes.
But we're encouraged to be in competition.
And I'm very conscious of that, as I said at the beginning, that because certain provider organisations, some of the bigger ones, are saying, we want this, we'll pay for it, but not everybody can afford that, and that's then puts inequality in it.
But I guess that thing about
Sorry,
go on.
I'm from a company in Lancashire, and we purchase something called PRT, which it has a theory based on PBM and called PBS. So it is very similar, and it's got everything that I think we need, but it also includes physical interventions. So we were looking at PBS for the other people in our services who have some challenges but don't need physical interventions, because obviously we want to make sure all of our staff are covered. And because of the money and the time it takes for our one trainer to do that, we're limited, so that's why we're looking at PBS. But in Lancashire, around the PRT, we actually have a consortia that we set up, and we have an agreement with PRT, but we use the consortia as a means of all the trainers from the people that are in the consortia support each other to do the training around the PBM and the physical interventions. And each organisation have paid PRT initially, but then we pay a very small amount to the consortia, and then the staff, the trainers, then move across all the services to provide free training, and the service in itself then puts the bill of that. But it actually works out really well, because I can get a lot more staff trained, and I don't need to release myself or the other trainer in order to do that. So it does help in working together. But then on Friday last week I was in Manchester, because they were looking at introducing a PBS coaching and mentoring scheme. So I went along because I thought, well, this might be the answer to covering the services that don't require physical intervention. And they were sort of not so much selling it to you, but telling you all about this PBS programme they were developing, but only for Manchester. So that only covered one area of our organisation. But then there was also lots of requirements about the only way you can get on it is if you've got somebody who's petals trained. And then I said, so is there a manual? Is there some way of checking, once you've trained this staff member, is there a way of then training them and checking that every year what you're teaching them is right, or that they're keeping up with their CPD themselves? And they said, no, it's a one-off training course. And then I said, right, well, we've got organisations across Manchester, Lancashire and West Lancs. So what about those areas? They said, well, we can only train the one. So I said, well, what about purchasing a few extra places on this mentoring and coaching scheme? And they said, that'll be £1,000 a head, and you have to purchase 10.
It sounds a little bit to me as if that's being sort of promoted as some sort of...
Yeah, they said we only have so many places free for this mentoring scheme. But when I was looking at it, I was saying, well, it's no different to what we're actually purchasing. And then the man actually said, why don't you just go on the internet and produce your own PBS training course? Is what he said.
And this is exactly why we're publishing a standard.
Yeah.
That is what's being represented all over the country.
Yeah.
And I think I asked the question this morning, and Peter's apologised for the people that were in the same room. I think we need to get to a point where we robustly quantify what we're calling PBS training. So, because I've had similar experiences, so I have a national post. So I've got different teams in Manchester and down in Somerset where they're being approached by local health authority boards who I think have blocked to purchase stuff, and offering our staff, free places and stuff with a view that we'll purchase something later. But in my view, it's not PBS training. So we've been quite good at screening what we're being offered, because just because it's free doesn't necessarily mean it's good. But I'm very aware there's other, there won't be people like me or my colleagues in the same post as me that are able to screen what's being branded as PBS training when actually it's not PBS training, and it's not competency